Les doy la más cordial bienvenida. Este es Praxis TV, un programa de la Escuela de Filosofía de la Universidad Nacional de Costa Rica. Y hoy nos encontramos acá para continuar con el ciclo de conferencias que hemos titulado Deconstruir la comunidad. Este es un trabajo conjunto entre la Escuela de Filosofía y la Escuela Ecuménica de la Universidad Nacional. Hoy tenemos el gusto de contar con la presencia del profesor Gil Anidjar de la Universidad de Columbia. El tema propiamente lo hemos titulado Mitología Roja, Cristianismo y Comunidad. Para acompañar esta discusión, adicionalmente tenemos a el profesor José María Hernández, director del Departamento de Filosofía de la Universidad Nacional de Educación a Distancia de España. Entonces, profesor José María, le doy la bienvenida a este espacio. Muchas gracias por estar acá.
Thank you for having me.
También nos acompaña mi colega, el profesor Jonathan Pimentel Chacón, de la Escuela Ecuménica de Ciencias de la Religión. Jonathan, bienvenido a este espacio.
Muchas gracias, Diego, profesor Anidjar, profesor Hernández.
Y desde luego nuestro conferencista principal, el profesor Gil Anidjar, es profesor de la Universidad de Columbia en Nueva York, en el Departamento de Religión y de Estudios del Medio Oriente, Sudáfrica y Estudios Africanos. Dentro de sus publicaciones, voy a leer solo algunos de los títulos por la amplia publicación del profesor Anidjar, entre ellos Nuestro espacio en Al-Ándalus, Cabala, Filosofía y Literatura, en Cartas Árabe Judías. Este es un texto publicado en 2002 por la editorial Stanford. El judío, el árabe, una historia del enemigo, publicado en 2003 por la Universidad de Stanford. De 2014, creo que tiene una edición previa, 2013, publicado por Columbia University Press, Sangre, una crítica del cristianismo, texto sobre el cual queremos hablar hoy, y aparecido hace algunos años, que llamamos Destrucción, Heidegger y Derrida, aparecido en francés, publicado por la editorial de la Universidad de Montreal en 2017. So, Professor Anidjar, we are honored and really thankful to have you here with us. So the floor is yours. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here and having this conversation with you. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Diego, for this invitation. Grateful to meet you, Jose. I will try not to speak for too long, and in order to situate my relationship to the question of community. The first thing I want to say is that when I use the term Christianity or Christian community, I tend to raise a question as to what we understand by that term, Christianity. Historically, a more, I don't know if popular, but a more famous question has been the Jewish question, which has raised over the centuries the question of what are the Jews? The Jews are considered a religion, they're considered a nation, they're considered a culture, they're considered an ethnicity, and the disagreements among those notions with regard to the Jews. Of course, the notion of race also comes up in contexts that are not exclusively Nazi, the Nazi context. All those make up for a very acrimonious dispute over how we understand the Jews, let's say for now, as a community. It seems to me that our understanding of Christianity as a religion is something that needs to be placed under interrogation. For even if we have a very limited historical sense, we can recognize that over 2,000 years, Christianity, whatever it is, has not remained identical to itself. It has changed. It has become a political force. It has become an imperial force. It has been, if we jump to early modernity, it has become privatized. Religion itself, we are told by experts in religious studies and historians, religion itself has changed. And so to say that Christianity is a religion is really not sufficient unless we factor in the transformations that Christianity itself has undergone and the transformation that whatever it is that we call religion means. If the meaning of Christianity, if the meaning of what it is to be a Christian is suspended, if we just say, let us assume that there is such a thing as Christianity, it is impossible to deny. There are Christians, many Christians over the course of history and in today's world. As we can see, by the way, from the debates on abortion right now in the United States, even Christians don't agree with each other, yes, as to what exactly should be forbidden and how when it comes to such an important question. So, of course, Christianity is also a site of conflict and disagreements, right? Catholics and Protestants, etc. But if we grant that they are Christians and they have been Christians, let us suspend what it is that we mean by that term and engage with the history, the practices, the texts of Christianity, of the Christian tradition, and raise the question anew as to what Christianity is. Now, I work for the most part as a translator, both in the sense that I translate texts, but also in the sense that concepts, for me, are concepts that have traveled. That's not exactly original for me to say that, but insofar as they travel, they carry a certain understanding of the real. So to give the most expected example at this particular point, if religion was, before it was privatized, was, let's say, a way of life, yes, to be a Christian meant to adhere to a way of life, by the time modernity arrives, to be a Christian is to have a religion, yes, to be a Christian in an active manner at certain times of the day, at certain times of the week, in certain places, the church or not. And so religion is a concept that defines over the course of time to very different, in terms of their breadth, to very different areas of being, of existence, yes? So roughly in the Middle Ages, Christianity occupies almost the whole space of a person's life, whereas in modernity, Christianity occupies a much smaller, usually we say, and again, we don't even have to agree on that, yes, but I'm talking here about conventions of understanding that tell us that religion becomes privatized, and so Christianity becomes a matter of the heart, something private, something that belongs to the individual much more than to the community, right? That is why we can speak about the distinction between religion and politics, right? Because religion doesn't belong to the political sphere, or so we are told repeatedly, yes? That being said, the term politics also has a history. Over against the term religion, which comes from Latin, the terms politics comes from Greek. It's not really a surprise that religion and politics don't mix, because whatever Latin understands under the term religion cannot quite correspond to what the Greeks understand by the term religion, which they don't have because it's a Latin term. And so politics, right? And some a linguist like Emile Benveniste has done very interesting work on the distinction between polis and civitas, right? Between the city in Latin and the polis in Greek, in order, for example, to argue that polis is the original term from which politike, which means the citizen, is derived, whereas civitas is derived from civis, and civis is the citizen. So although it's a rough argument, you could argue that in Rome, the citizens make the civitas, whereas in Greece, the polis makes the citizens, right? So very different understanding of what it means to be a collective, an organized collective. So the question of translation, and of course the word community, which we are using here, the word community comes from Latin as well. So then the question is, if community is a Latin term, what would it mean to use the word community to speak, for example, about Jews? Are Jews a community? Does the Latin word correspond to whatever it is that we want to designate Jews as? So the Jewish question raises questions like, are the Jews a nation or a religion? Natio, religio. Two terms, again, from the Latin that presumably have little to do with the Jewish tradition, in which Latin doesn't really take that much space, yes? So as we translate, we carry a certain division of the real, and we embrace those divisions as if they apply to whatever it is that we're speaking about. At some level, this is necessary because we speak the language that we speak. Both you and I, you in Spanish, me in English, we speak from a somehow Latinized tradition. English a little less, but not that much less. So we don't have that much choice over the words that we use, but those words also determine our understanding as to what we think are different spheres, religion and politics, right? Q in economics, and again, we go back to Greek, oikonomia, with all the baggage that is involved. So all this to say that the way I engage the question of community is first by recognizing that we have to suspend our understanding and the understanding that is carried by etymology, by traditions of understanding and of practice that are not necessarily shared across the board. Now, there is one particular thinker who I have a very ambivalent relation to, but I can recognize that in the 19th century, he was one of the most important intellectuals around. And his name is Ernest Renan. He's not very well remembered, except for what he has written about the nation. But he wrote an extraordinary amount of books on all kinds of subjects, and he was considered an authority on many of those subjects. In the text called What is a Nation, Renan begins in a way that to me is extraordinary, because it raises precisely the question of translation on the question of the community, or as he discusses it, on the question of the nation. I'm going to read, and maybe since you will need the translation, I can tell you, I'm assuming the text, What is a Nation, is translating to Spanish. And just so you know, it is the first paragraph of that text that I'm going to read from. The very first line of the essay, What is a Nation? It begins like this. I propose to analyze with you an idea that seems clear, but lends itself to the most dangerous misunderstandings. The forms of human society are exceedingly varied. The vast agglomerations, I'm gonna underscore the terms that he uses here. Yes, the vast agglomerations of men in China, Egypt, or the most ancient Babylonia. Agglomeration. 2, the tribes of the Hebrews, the Arabs. 3, the city-states of Athens or Sparta. 4, the assemblies of disparate lands after the fashion of the Achaemenid Empire, the Roman Empire, the Carolingian Empire. 5, the communities without a fatherland preserved by a religious bond, such as those of the Israelites and the Parsis. 6, nations such as France, England, and most modern European independent entities. 7, confederations after the fashion of Switzerland and America. 8, kinships such as those that race, or rather language, establishes between the different branches of the Teutons or the different branches of the Slavs. Here are types of groupings, each of which exist or has existed and cannot be confused one with the other, except with the direst of consequences. Okay? Now, Renan, who was, even though he was complicated on the question of race, Renan was undoubtedly racist, undoubtedly making hierarchies among different human groupings. But because, or perhaps in addition to his racism, his hierarchized views, he recognized that human groupings, as he calls them, collectivities, are not the same across the board, across cultures. They're not organized in the same way, they don't understand themselves in the same manner, and they have different principles, as it were. Some have principles above, some have principles below. Some organize themselves against the state, yes, as Pierre Clastre had it, and some seek to form a state. Some engage in military conquest, others do not. Not all collectives are the same, which is why to refer to political organization is a bit of a mistake, because we understand collectives as political according to Greek logic. But the very logic of organization, of groupings, of collectives, is where the question of politics and religion and medicine and science and economics and all of that enter. Now, we may say all collectives have all of these dimensions. That's possible, but this requires very careful work and the understanding that translation is always operative and always creating issues. Now, one of the most crucial translating work that has been done for our understanding of those different groupings across the world is, of course, the work of anthropologists, right, in the 19th and 20th century, which has inherited, of course, all kinds of work from missionaries and colonial administrators, etc. What anthropologists did with Lewis Henry Morgan at the head has been to use a word that was inherited from Rome and massively translated by the church. And that word, which is the basis of notions of kinship, is consanguinitas. So that Lewis Henry Morgan goes about classifying systems of kinship, and pretty much everybody after him, all the way to David Schneider, the American anthropologist who questions the literality of the term blood, but metaphorizing the term blood does not help. because the question that is raised by consanguinity is the fact that kinship is understood as being based not only in blood, but in substance. Think of totem and taboo. The sharing of substance is considered to be the basis of community everywhere. Community, comunitas. We won't have time to get into the argument that Roberto Esposito makes about this. We could, if you'd like, but for now, I'll merely say that when we speak of communities of substance, a term that recurs repeatedly across the literature that deals with ancient cultures and primitive cultures, so-called primitive cultures, and European culture, the term that recurs is blood, by way, among others, of the term consanguinity, right? Blood is thicker than water. Now, we know that the notion of blood has a certain history. We also know that political arrangement, organizational arrangement, collective arrangements, again, to go back to Ono, are different across cultures. And even when I say culture, by the way, I'm still translating from the Latin, right? So to call different cultures cultures is also a kind of Latin imperialism, yes? Derrida speaks of global Latinology, I think, or global Latinity, right? The fact that Latin, which is the Christian language, it became the Christian language, has spread in such a way that we understand by way of its concepts. The only point I want to make is that I have found no evidence that collectives such as those that Renan describes have ever deployed a notion of shared substance in order to understand themselves, right? Anything you read about totemism, anything you read about the Greek polis, anything you read about different organizations across time, a shared substance is really not given. It usually appears in a work of translation, a Western translation. So if we grant that collectives organize themselves in different ways, according to different logics and principles, and that substance does not have to be part of it, then the particular contribution that Christianity would have made is not only that it has spread the use of blood, the understanding that kinship is predicated on blood, including the notion that politics must free itself from kinship, right? That family and politics are two different things, that one must transcend the familial community in order to engage in politics. That notion is predicated on an understanding of the collective as sharing a substance. If we understand that what Christianity has contributed to anthropology writ large, meaning our understanding of different cultures and communities as cultures and communities based on a shared substance, then we might recognize how deep Christianity goes, even among those who do not understand themselves as Christians, but who now understand themselves as sharing a substance. Everything about genetics has hardly transformed that, yes? Because we're still talking about some kind of materiality which has no materiality. Blood is a materiality that has no materiality. The blood of Christ is material, but obviously also not. And the role of the blood of Christ in the dissemination of that understanding of a shared substance, insofar as that blood was consumed, is of course key to the story I want to tell. So I think I will stop at that. But just to summarize, we have to, I don't know if deconstruct is quite the word, I'm not sure we are there yet, But we have to understand that the word community carries an understanding that is, if I may put it this way, already contaminating, meaning that it already isolates a certain way of practice and self-understanding, which may not apply to whatever collective we are looking at. And so if we can learn from Renan, something that I'm, a little unsure about, but at least insofar as he sensitizes us to the question of translation, then we might recognize that community is a translation, and it's a translation that works both ways. It affects the way we understand collectives, groupings in different places, even among those that do not call and would not call themselves Christians. And then, of course, we'll have to ask, how far has the blood spread? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Anidjar. We missing here the applause kind of sound in Zoom. I hope they work on that. So in order to react to Professor Anidjar's words, I think we can make a first set of impressions. Jonathan, Jose, and I, maybe we can share our thoughts and our questions with Professor Anidjar. So, Jonathan, if you may.
Yeah, I can start, I guess. I think that when I first read the Professor Anidjar's book, blog, I immediately recognized the importance of blood for our local Central American history, recent history. And one event that always holds my attention is when Ignacio Ellacuría, at that time, he was the president of the Universidad Centroamericana in Salvador, was giving a speech in the ceremony when they were awarding Oscar Arias Sanchez, by the time the president of Costa Rica. They were awarded Oscar Arias Doctor Honoris Causa in political science. And at the end of his speech, Ellacuría reminded Oscar Arias and reminded the audience in the university what he called a theolegumenon, that explains, that for him fully explains the understanding that Christianity has about both salvation and liberation. And the theolegumenon is well known, but in that context, it was surprising. The theolegumenon is nulla redentio sine fusione sanguinis. That is to say, there is no redemption without the spread or the effusion of blood. And Ellacuría says precisely that's the truth of Christianity. There is no outside of it. There is no salvation, there is no liberation without, he concludes saying, without sacrifice. Sadly, as you know, just 2 months later, his own blood was spread. Yeah. In the same university that he was giving that speech that day, he and others were killed. So when I read the blood, I say, yes, it's true. It is like that. So there is no, I'll say there is no dispute about that. The only thing that I'll say is that perhaps what Eyacuría say is that the dream of Christianity is that there is no need for more effusion of blood. That's the promise of Christianity, not that blood has to be spread over and over in an infinite cycle, but that there was blood that was spread at some point, and because that blood was spread, no more blood has to be spread. That's the promise. Let's say that's the promise. No, the promise is not that more blood has to be spread, but that no more blood has to be spread. That's at least that's my understanding of the Theolegumenon, as Eyacuría say. And then I have Professor Anidjar didn't refer to this in his talk, but it is in the book, chapter 3 of blood. And I just have it's mostly a question. You can recognize within Christian theology, not to use Christianity, Christian theology, at least the most traditional Christian theology, let's say Paul, or Augustine, Luther, there is this idea that there is no equivalent between, let's say, money and grace or redemption. That is to say, you cannot buy redemption, you cannot buy grace. It's beyond oikonomia in the sense of money, let's say. But at the same time, and this is my question, if this isn't clear enough that there is no an equivalent between grace and money, why is that you are, it seems to me you are really convinced that there is a continuity and affinity between capitalism and Christianity? Or let's say between Christian theology and capitalism. And it is interesting that you, as I remember, you mentioned a word that I really like, a thinker that I really like to read from Latin America, León Rosisler, that claims the same reading Augustine, the Confessions. And the Confessions, Augustine, were fundamental to prepare the subjectivity that created capitalism. But if you read Augustine, you can reach to a different conclusion as well. So that's a question that I have. Why is that you push that way? There is affinities, there is continuity between capitalism and Christianity or Christian theology. I don't know which term is better in this case.
Thank you. Should I wait for others and then answer, or should I respond a little bit now?
Well, for the complex of the question, maybe it's better if you answer right away, and then we give the word to Professor Jose Maria. So go ahead, Professor Anidjar.
Thank you. So as you recall, I do recognize that there are intense disagreements within Christianity, right? Not only between denominations, but among the very same theologians among themselves, right? There are contradictions, there are changes, there are questions of interpretation, and so there's no question that to make somehow massive arguments like the one I made that points to a continuity to structures that are shared between Christianity and capitalism, there's always going to be the possibility of saying, but everything about Christianity is opposed to capitalism. And there are Christians in the world that continue to say that. And I certainly don't mean to not recognize them. Sadly, historically, capitalism has won and Christianity has not disappeared. And it has not simply moved into the resistance to capitalism. It has also embraced capitalism, right? So what I try to explain are those moments of congruence. And I do not, by any means, engage sufficiently with the moments of resistance, the moments of contradiction, the moments of refusal even. One of the beautiful things that you described is something that I believe René Girard describes as the sacrifice of sacrifice, right? The sacrifice to end all sacrifice. We're not there yet. And in the meantime, a sacrificial logic, which by the way is not the one I'm interested in. It's not the sacrificial blood that I'm interested in, although I can see that there's a connection, since the blood of Christ is obviously sacrificial in itself, but I think it has other dimensions that must be recognized. One of those I was most interested in is the fact that, as far as I can tell, the very notion of pure blood, right, of a being who is recognizably human, who would have pure blood, is absolutely a Christian invention, right? There is no medical system that I'm aware of, right? No understanding of physiology that actually grants a purity of blood. But the notion of a purity of blood has emerged within the context of the attribution to Jesus of pure blood. And that pure blood has then been granted, as it were, by Christians to themselves, right? Limpieza de sangre, which is not just a kind of Hispanic exception, but speaks already in Shakespeare, for example, right? When Shylock is forbidden from dropping a drop, right, of Christian blood. So once you have a notion of Christian blood and that blood is pure, something different has happened, which is no longer sacrificial, but it is in fact almost and becomes medical. One of the distinctions I haven't spoken about is the distinction between politics and medicine, right? Which may or may not be applicable. So, so to recover dimensions of blood that confuse us a little bit between medicine and politics, between politics and religion, is part of what I'm doing. And I didn't want to only engage in the sacrificial logic. But even if I do, I would say that insofar as the end of sacrifices has not yet come about, blood is still with us. And that is the way in which Christianity, and not only those that are explicitly and vocally Christian, but one of the ways in which Christianity has preserved itself is precisely by way of the significance of blood in many, many realms. One of them is economic, right? The equation of money and blood is simply very strange. Just like the notion that Jews who converted are not really Christian because their blood is different. It should strike us as strange. Now, of course, we are after centuries of racism, and so it's no longer so strange, but it should be. Yes, there's no reason to locate difference in blood. It could be located in whatever, right? If we want to go there, some people talk about the smell of Jews and of other so-called races. Yes, it doesn't have to be in the blood, and insofar as it is overdetermined. So it's that presence, as it were, of blood in the understanding of capitalism, of money, the circulation of money, the circulation of blood as the circulation of money and vice versa, that leads me to raise the question of Christianity and capitalism again. I'm not sure I do a sufficient job I think there are other arguments that have been made that are more convincing than mine with regard to the connection between Christianity and capitalism, aside from historical and geographical coincidence. Yes. But I think that blood has not been given its due. And so that is part of the way in which I want to make that, that connection. If only Christians of the world united against capitalism, the way the liberation theologians did, we would be, of course, in a very different world. As I don't need to tell you, even the Chinese are capitalists by now. So, you know, our chances are pretty thin of the masses rising against capitalism. But there is a kind of origin story that needs to be thought about for the enduring power that it has.
Thank you so much, Professor Anidjar. Professor José María, adelante.
Hello, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this fabulous presentation. I really enjoyed your presentation and your talk. And I want to start saying that it's a coincidence that we are recording this program today, the 12th of October, which used to be the day of the rapes. And now it's called the Day of the Nation in Spain and the Day of the Cultures in Costa Rica. Which is something that has to do a lot with this lecture. And I really find your work a very powerful work, your book on blood, with using all these different trends of philosophy, literature, theology, history, and this is really impressive. And at the same time, I also find very useful your short presentation today, because in a sense helped me to understand the project. Because sometimes when you meet so many sources, one loses the view, you know, the point, you know, as they. My question is about this, because I'm really interested about the political consequences of your work. You know? What do you really want to say about this redefinition of Christianity as something based on blood, as a concept, as a metaphor, and the endurability of this concept? And I'm really aiming to ask you about this, because obviously when you talk, for example, about Carl Smith at the beginning of the book and the theological political thesis, and that you bear that in mind all the time. Well, Carl Smith is an old acquaintance of all Spaniards. You know, he had a relationship with many Spanish speakers in Spain and in Latin America as well, and we are familiar with that thesis about the process of secularization, the Carl Smith version, and of course it matches with the work. I mean, you can say, well, obviously, what we used to call faith or blood now is called culture or nation. And of course, there is a continuity there. There is a translation from a theological concept into a political concept. And this I mean, I recognize that this obviously arises the question of, well, what do you have to say about this redefinition of religion in that sense? I mean, what are the consequences of this religion, for the rest of humanity? I mean, are they good? Are they having a problem actually for the relation between different people? I mean, and this is one question that we have to answer, of course. And but at the same time, I mean, as I said before, your work is a very powerful work, and it's full of different sources that they don't have to do anything with Smith. and probably they have different targets. I mean, you talk, I mean, you use
I'm not sure, sorry, because your voice is coming in and out a little bit. So I didn't understand that last part.
Yeah, but at the same time, I mean that your work uses sources that might be not in a good relation with the Catholic understanding of what is secularization. I mean, in a sense that, well, you mentioned all the authors, sorry, that they might have a completely different vision about what is the meaning of secularization, but perhaps they're more interested in talking about the secularization of religion instead of the secularization of politics. And in this sense, there's other sources that are in your book. They might, open a way to talk about Christianity as a theme in a process, as a history that has been changing along the years, and it's not the same. I mean, basically, Carl Smith's point of view it matches very much with the thesis of a continuity of the idea of Christianity. If you talk about the secularization of religion, for example, you mentioned Marcel Gauchet, then we start to think in Christianity in another completely different terms. So it might be interesting to ask you, how do you understand your work or how it fits in the current debate on secularization? I mean, where you stand in that debate? Closer to Gauchet or closer to Carl Smith?
Thank you. These are great questions and very nice compliments. I think that so the argument about continuity and discontinuity is always going to be fraught because you don't need to be a logician to recognize that any argument about discontinuity needs to grant that there is some kind of continuity, because otherwise we're simply speaking about completely different things, right? There can only be discontinuity between things that are related to each other. And not between things that are not related to each other, right? There is no discontinuity between the North Pole and the planet Mercury. There is simply two different things. To the extent that there's continuity, there can be discontinuity, and vice versa. So insofar as we can grant that human beings have existed on the same planet, it's going to be very hard to argue that there's complete discontinuity between them and between different historical periods. The question, of course, is what continuities and what discontinuities are we exploring? Roughly speaking, I would say that Schmidt makes the argument that politics disappears. For him, secularization is actually about the rise of liberalism and the end of antagonism, of a proper antagonism, a properly political antagonism. I'm not sure that this has been said enough. Yes, he does say that modern concepts are secularized theological concepts like sovereignty, etc. But it seems to me that what he laments is a loss of politics, a loss of an understanding of the collective that is Europe, Jus Gentium, for example, and a kind of diffusion across the planet and across different political parties. Gauchet speaks about basically.
Just a minute, do you think that it's the same, the Carl Smith of political theology and the Carl Smith of the numbers of the earth? Do you think it's the same? It's the same system?
I actually think that it's the same historical argument. In other words, the transition is located in the same 16th century. but he describes it as a geopolitical occurrence in the nomos, whereas he describes it as an inner civic, as it were, transformation within Europe in the concept of the political and in political theology. But I do think that he keeps returning to that historical break. And basically Gaucher agrees, only they would not agree on defining the political or on defining the theological. But they all agree that somewhere in the 16th century, something changed. Now, Gaucher, of course, would even argue that that transformation, which is a transformation brought about by Christianity, the religion of the end of religion, comes about with modernity, when religion truly ends. And what emerges is the political. I like to talk, in this context about the way in which freedom, libertas, played in the debate between church and state in the Middle Ages over the investiture contest, and in the 19th century over secularization. Because in the Middle Ages, the church, in the investiture contest, the church said, we want to be free of the secular power, right? We want freedom from the secular authority. 9 centuries later, the same dance, the state says, we want to be free of the church. So there's a continuity of a discourse of freedom, and there's a continuity of the partners, right? Many things have changed, but the basic partners are the same. And Gaucher is very much within that, right? So modernity brings about the freedom from religion, the end of religion. But the agreement fundamentally, which to me is the most interesting, is that we are no longer Christian. Not religious, Christian. Now, the critique of religion didn't last for a millisecond without expanding itself to all religions. And if I live in the United States and I criticize the United States, it would be very strange if I started by saying, what the United States is doing is really like what every state is doing. It's not really different. So let's criticize all the states. People who are not in the United States, which, unless I'm mistaken, remains the greatest superpower at work today, might say that the criticism should not be so generous and extended to all other states, that there's room to criticize the United States because it is the United States before we say it's just like everybody else. And the critique of religion has operated exactly like that. The moment you raise the question of Christianity, immediately what does Voltaire do? He writes Muhammad and fanaticism. And I found this generosity a little troubling, because criticism begins at home. So let's keep it at home for a while. And as far as I can tell, it hasn't stayed home. So are we truly no longer Christian? We would think of ourselves as no longer Christians, right? And even Christians agree that we should be more Christian, right? A la Schmidt. And I said, let's check that again. Mm-hmm. Let's check again that transformation. Let's check whether it was in fact a transformation, right? The consensus among people who are in so much disagreement over the transformation that was brought about by modernity, by colonialism, by capitalism, that is also the problem, yes? We think of the break, some of us, as a political economy, capitalism, as a problem of conquest, colonialism, or as a problem of modernity, a change of time, yes? I want us to think those three together: political economy, conquest, and modernity as scientific or whatever. And the name I have for that remains Christianity, which split itself in different ways and exonerated itself in that particular way. So I want to assume continuity, not to essentialize Christianity, but precisely to recognize that it transformed itself. And in its transformation, it didn't stop being itself. It just took a different form and organized things a little differently. I grant that. The Reformation did that too. Yes. But nobody would say that, although some did, of course, that the Reformation was the end of Christianity. Right? But their perspective was problematic. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Anidjar. Thank you, Professor Jose Maria. As you were speaking on the substance of community, I recalled one part of the Jew, the Arab history of the enemy is the word brother. You said in one part in there, I'm always haunted by this part of your work, that brother works as some sort of performative, where brother makes the enemy, defines who is my enemy. And I recall this in the middle of, well, from Central America, we always have really big numbers of immigrants that cross over to the United States, and migration always raises the question of brotherhood. Who is my brother and who isn't? But not in the same, in the sense of let's be a good brother, let's take care of the other, but in the sense of immunity. We have to keep safe the brothers.
Right.
So I have always the how question. It was a promise from Derrida's work, the deconstruction of the brother, of the ghost of the brother. How should we deal with that big ghost on our backs?
It's a fantastic question. You know, I haven't spoken about Derrida enough, and of course, my debt to him remains. I almost want to say growing. I'm not sure I completely addressed the part of your question, Jose, where you asked about what political consequences, right? We stayed with secularism rather with political consequences.
Yeah.
I should say,
in a sense, you have answered.
Sorry, go on.
In a sense,
I did
answer that, because I understand that with your approach, Christianity is still, subject to a claim of responsibility for the modern world. I mean, for how the world works today. I mean, in a sense, you keep Christianity as accountable for that. I mean, so I'm satisfied with your answer.
I should also say that, and it's related to Diego's question, that part of what I miss, there are many things I miss in the world, I suppose, but one of the things I miss is that if we recognize that Christianity is still much more active, much more present in the world, we might also recognize that however we understand the opposition between Christianity and Islam, it has a theological dimension, which is not at all granted in public discourse. That there might be a theological disagreement is also something that seems to me has to be brought out, right? So if I may contradict myself a little bit, when I argue that the way in which we distinguish between religion and politics is overdetermined by Greek and Latin, I would also want to say that if we recognize the importance of religion in the old sense, we might also recognize that we're missing some of the dispute that took place between Christianity and, of course, Judaism, but also Islam. And to conduct the debate at that level, which we know, for example, on the question of abortion, there are theological questions that are enormous. And we don't have space to discuss them because, we can't on TV engage in arguments that take more than 35 seconds. Yes. So we need to have time to raise a large number of questions over what might be the nature of the disagreement, rather than just say, well, we're secular and they're fanatics, and we have nothing to do with each other. Now, on the question of the brother, I think that Derrida was very clear that about the role that Christianity played in the rise of fraternity as an ideal for the community. I'll give you a preview because I'm about to go and give lectures. The theme of which is mothers. The title I've given to my lectures is The Sovereignty of Mothers. And one of the things I want to ask is, let's grant that brother is a metaphor, right? Which is not entirely true, but let's grant that brother is a metaphor for a political relation. What would happen if we tried a different metaphor? What if we tried to think of politics as maternal? If we agree that brother is a metaphor, then there's no reason to be attached to the metaphor unless we claim that it has a literality that is necessary, right? And not to be too stereotypical, because one of the questions is how gendered should we understand mothers? It's important to understand that mothers have, for the most part, been women, but it's also important to understand that the distinction between woman and mother is also very important to maintain, yes? Because there's a misogyny that consists in saying that every woman should become a mother, and we don't want to endorse that either. So suspending the question of the gendering of mothers, one might recognize that there are many mothers and some of them are not women. Today, it's kind of obvious, but technology, which has been around for much longer than we think, technology is also one way in which that is going to become possible, if it's not already. So if mothering is one of the synonyms we have for caring, then maybe it's important that rather than ask, who is my brother, we should ask, who should I take care of? And isn't that the most basic of political relations? Am I my brother's keeper? Yes, keeper. I should keep, not just mine, but anyone that comes under my care. And to rethink that seems to me very, very important. And the dream, which is a little like, Jonathan, the dream that you evoked, that the sacrifice of sacrifice, is also the dream that all men, maybe all women too, will be brothers, which will really require, right? That's where Derrida goes with the sister, right? We will need to expand the metaphor. Although Derrida, to me, surprisingly, remains with the image of the sister. He evokes the mother, and I recently found out that Derrida had much to say about mothers that has not really been sufficiently studied. But the point is that there are more resources in our language than we grant, and so to recognize that the metaphor of the brother has hidden the enemy, yes, has hidden the way it energizes enmity under the figure of there is no Jew, no Greek, no male, no female, right? That dream has not been realized. And as long as it's not realized, the differences are hierarchical and sedimented. And so with the sedimentation of fraternity, we also have the sedimentation of enmity. And we need to bring that to the fore. We need at least to recognize that our discourse of fraternity is one of the engines of hostility. And I'm not dreaming of an end to violence and an end to hostility, but I am wondering about what it means to be responsible. What does it mean to say that a dictator should not invade a country when those who say that have invaded 2 countries in the past 20 years? I am not for the invasion of Ukraine, but I don't know that the Americans have a leg to stand on in order to say, don't invade a country when they've invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, with the consequences that are still with us and that have a lot to do with Ukraine. Yes. So if responsibility could become, in fact, what it should be, which is responsibility for what we are and what we do, then perhaps we'll have a chance. I'm not extremely optimistic, but something needs to happen. And the brother has actually exonerated us from that responsibility, because if you are my brother, then the enemy is the other. I'm the enemy. Yes, I have to take responsibility for the enmity that I am. Right? In another context, I would have to say Cain is my ancestor. Yes, not just Abel, not just the victim, not just the good brother, which in the Bible is very opaque, by the way, but we don't need to get into that.
Thank you, Professor Anidjar. I think you have provided us with a lot of material during this conversation to think over the time to come. I was wondering if Jonathan or Jose Maria has some closing words for this session.
Well, one of the last few comments that Professor Anidjar was mentioned is really interesting. That precisely let's say the modern invention, or one of the modern inventions or comprehensions of politics, starts precisely when you leave the care of your mother. Let's say Hobbes. Politics starts when you leave the house, leave your mother, even you forget the language of your mother and acquire the language of the father. So it's a radical separation that inaugurates the politics. The distinction, the break with the female, let's say, not just the mother, but the female, and that appears not just in Hobbes, but it appears also in Locke and in all that tradition. To become a man, to become a citizen, requires to abandon the care of the mother, the care of the female, and being autonomous in this kind of tradition. Being autonomous implies precisely stay away from whatever is you understand, your mother or your sister, etc. So yes, it's really interesting to start thinking or formulating a language that goes back and tries to avoid that separation, avoid that break. It'll be interesting, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I simply never understood what it might mean.
Yeah.
What does it mean to leave your mother? My mother is always my mother.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. What part of me should I separate from in order to emancipate myself? Yeah. If that is emancipation, then let's call amputation an emancipation too. I think I'm going to emancipate myself from my arm by cutting it off, but that would be strange. Mm. Yes. It is absolutely about the understanding of emancipation and of political maturity, as it were. Mm-hmm. Right? Another metaphor.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan and Professor Anidjar. Professor Jose Maria.
Yeah, for my part, I just want to thank you again for this presentation, and I'm really happy because you really answered my question. I was puzzled, you know, because sometimes, you know, this is tour de force, this is very great works on religion. They are so, sometimes they are so big and so well furnished intellectually that it gives no room for taking into account, you know, the consequences of the critique of Christianity. And so I'm happy with the results of this.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very kind of you to say, and I'm glad. I'm often told that I kind of dodge questions, so I'm happy to know that today I didn't. Thank you. It was really a wonderful conversation. I'm very grateful for the invitation and for the occasion to speak with you. And yeah, until next time, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you then, Professor Jose Maria Hernandez, Professor Jonathan Pimentel, Professor Gil Anidjar. Thank you so much for this insightful conversation we just had. Y muchas gracias a todas las personas que nos han seguido en este programa de Praxis TV. Como dice el profesor Anidjar, hasta la próxima. Muchas gracias.